Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now in our third season, and we remain just as excited as ever to continue to help you explore and understand the unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here are issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung, and heart issues, and more. So listen in today as we interview experts for a special show today on what we want to call the road from COP26. What did we get done? You know, back in mid-November, and actually before, daily we were being inundated with information or terms or what have you about COP26, this big environmental confab that was going to happen in Glasgow, Scotland. And then that went on for 2 weeks, and then we immediately segued into Thanksgiving, then Christmas, then New Year's, and now things are settling down somewhat. And so we want to look at it because it was important. The climate summit in Glasgow actually saw the planet take major steps toward addressing the climate crisis. But many of those involved think that it didn't make the giant leap needed, however, to limit our global warming to that magic figure of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the 2-week conference, however, brought together diplomats from nearly 200 nations to refine the details of the Paris Agreement, which everyone's heard about, and to keep hope alive of limiting the human-caused global warming, again, back down to that magic figure of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and to set more ambitious goals to cut emissions, to adapt climate change, and to provide the aid to the developing countries that they need because they're suffering the worst of the climate impacts. But actually, for all nations, the full implications of COP26 have begun to and will play out in the coming months and the coming years. But the negotiators from those nearly 200 companies unanimously signed what was called the Glasgow Climate Pact, I guess the newer version of the Paris Agreement. And in that pact, they agreed to ramp up significantly efforts to cut planet warming emissions and to call on wealthy countries such as the U.S., China, and others to double their funding to protect the poorer nations who have contributed the least to climate change, yet they also are suffering the deadliest consequences of it. Now, the New Deal, that is the Glasgow Pact, again falls short of some of the meeting's initial objectives as they went into it. But as the New York Times points out, the agreement is still really unclear on just how much and how quickly each nation must cut their emissions. It doesn't provide a clear plan to limit warming to, again, that magical 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. But it does go a long way, and it also addresses helping the vulnerable countries, who we all have to recognize that we're all in this together. And we've been seeing a really big worldwide example of that with the pandemic over the last 2 years. Now, fossil fuels, though, were mentioned in the text of this agreement for the first time in the history of the COPs, which could be considered a win-win-win, say researchers. But they also say the language was somewhat watered down by the biggies like in the U.S. The language was watered down from phasing out coal and fossil fuel subsidies and use altogether to watering it down to say phasing down. But anyway, researchers also have added that although the agreement recognizes the need for the wealthier countries to fund climate adaptation and mitigation in developing countries, they still didn't get that damage, loss, and mitigation fund that they wanted. But it is interesting because we're finding that the wealthier countries are still shouldering some of that burden that they caused one way or the other. We mainly see it in immigration, because immigration really is a form of the climate change migration, so to speak. Now, on the positive side, though, the Glasgow Agreement reinforces and reiterates the importance of fighting climate change and establishes that nations are not doing enough to prevent a global catastrophe. It also calls on nations to strengthen their own pledges to reduce emissions by the end of 2022, which is 3 years earlier than previously was laid out in the Paris Agreement. The new pact also solidifies details around how countries submit and report their climate change progress, the point of which is to encourage transparency, because that's a concern for everybody. And then there were many promises and many pledges made as a result of the COP26 negotiations. And now this is a lot. And here today to help us explore and understand what was accomplished at COP26 and why it is important for us is Dr. Jonathan Harris. Jonathan is with the Tufts University Global Development and Environment Institute. Jonathan is a visiting scholar there, as well as a senior research fellow at the Boston University Global Development Policy Center's Economics in Context initiative. Jonathan holds degrees from Harvard and Boston University, and he is past president of the United States Society for Ecological Economics. Jonathan is also co-author of a widely used text called Environmental and Natural Resource Economics, a Contemporary Approach. And he is author of Green Keynesianism, Beyond Standard Growth Paradigm in Building a Green Economy. Now, Jonathan, welcome. We're glad that you could be with us. And did I get all of that right?
Yes, you did, Bernice. That was quite a mouthful. Thank you for doing that.
It was quite a mouthful. And you were here with us earlier this year, so we were just so glad that we were able to get you back. And so we want to start out, though, as we talk about the road from or after COP26, is for you to start out telling us about the significance of what I was earlier calling the magical 1.5 degrees Celsius benchmark that all of the experts and the advocates talk about. What is the importance of that? How can ordinary people in their everyday lives think of that in a way that they almost immediately recognize its importance and its relevance to them?
Well, the conversation has shifted from 2 degrees centigrade to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the significance of that is that we're already seeing major climate impacts, which have made people think that this is not something in the future. It's something now. It's something more urgent. And nobody knows exactly for sure, what the impacts will be. But there's a strong sense that if you go as far as 2 degrees centigrade above the previous pre-industrial temperatures, that you will risk really major things like many feet of sea level, massive melting in the Arctic and Antarctic, major loss of tropical forests, destruction of species, or intensification of what we're already seeing in terms of storms, hurricanes, fires, floods, etc. So this has driven people to adopt the goal of 1.5 degrees centigrade. But that's a very ambitious goal. We already are 1.1 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial. So it doesn't leave us much margin at all. So basically what it tells us is urgency, and there's a lot of scientific opinion now behind this urgency. Even among scientists who have been concerned about this for decades, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, of which COP26 was the 26th meeting, started in 1992. But the sense of urgency has grown significantly. So what that means is very deep reductions in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, not just limiting how fast they grow, but bringing them down. And now people are talking a lot more about net zero, bringing them to zero. That's a huge challenge because right now the world is about 80% dependent on fossil fuels for its energy. So reducing by 10%, that's something you could think of might be fairly easy. Going to zero is much more ambitious and tough.
And we're 80%.
About 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuels, which emit carbon dioxide. So we need to shift to having 0% of our energy fossil fuel based.
By when?
By 2050 is what people are generally talking about for net zero, though 2030, which is pretty soon, has been established as an important intermediate goal, like to get some areas to net zero and others to 50% cutback.
Indeed. I remember in one of our last shows on energy, we did talk about the net zero. But you have said something that is very important, kind of makes me know that you lecture because you kept hitting at it. It's really about the whole point of that magical number. That benchmark is about urgency. It really
and
is.
At least in terms of formal lip service, agreeing to it, one of the accomplishments of COP26 is that all of the world's countries have essentially agreed to that. That doesn't mean they're actually going to do what they say, but it's a significant change from earlier when there wasn't no universal agreement on that.
Indeed. Doing it is one thing, but it's, I guess, to me, it's part of that leap forward is for all of them to acknowledge it. We're going to go to break right now, and we'll be right back on the other side with Dr. Jonathan Harris to tell us more about the road from COP26. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach, none mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. We are back with Dr. Jonathan Harris, visiting scholar at Tufts University, who is helping us understand the road from COP26, the road from Glasgow. And so Jonathan was really helping us to understand, I think, internalize what's going on when we continuously hear and see that term 1.5 degrees as the benchmark that we need to reach in terms of global warming. And it's all about the urgency. But why should people care about COP26 and what happened there?
Well, these international conferences may seem somewhat remote from people's everyday lives, but the fact is it's the only effective way to deal with the global climate change problem, which affects all of us. It's what economists call, use little jargon, a global public good. It's something which can't be produced by any individual or any business firm or any country by themselves. It has to be done on a global basis. So if we're going to get emissions significantly down, then everybody has to participate. And something like COP26 is the only forum that can make that happen. So that's why it's so important, and that's why it's so encouraging that there was some progress. If you ask me, was COP26 a success or a failure, I would say both. It was a success because the commitments that nations made have been significantly strengthened. There was a pledge for U.S.-China cooperation. There was a pledge to phase down, if not phase out, coal power. There was a pledge to cut methane emissions by 30%. There's a pledge to halt and reverse forest loss degradation. And there were other pledges to move towards zero emissions vehicles and to end financial support for fossil fuels. Now, the word pledge doesn't mean that will actually happen, but the fact that we do have countries committed to this is a major step forward.
It really is. That's exciting.
The failure part is that even if you add up everything that people pledge to, it doesn't get us close to 1.5 degree target. It leaves somewhere above 2 degrees, which many scientists now feel would verge on the catastrophic. And in terms of catastrophic, think of major melt in ice caps in Arctic and especially the Antarctic, much of which is already happening, which could completely flood New York City and other coastal cities. I mean, there could be, Miami is already suffering from this significantly, but you could see much, much more. You could see many feet of sea level rise. So, catastrophic for coastal cities, catastrophic for low-lying nations like Bangladesh, and we are basically verging on that. So we have to do a lot better. The president of the COP26, Alok Sharma, said we have to close the vast gap that remains, and he's absolutely right. He said we have kept 1.5 degrees alive, kept it within reach, but we have to close a vast gap. One of the positive things was that the conference moved from adjusting nations' commitments every 5 years to adjusting every year. And the idea is that each time nations are supposed to come back with better goals, with more dramatic cuts in carbon dioxide and specific plans for doing that.
I like that. So I guess, is that saying that next year in COP27?
COP27 this November in Egypt.
Oh, yeah, I remember seeing that. At COP27, when they'll be right in the middle of the hot place, then nations will come back adjusting what their commitments are, which then inherently makes them look at what they did or did not do.
Yes, that's another factor which you mentioned earlier, I think, was transparency.
Yes.
That nations will have to put on the table what they have and haven't done, and whether they are meeting their commitments to date.
Okay, I like that. I consider that to be a win, is that we've got annual reporting and conversation. I think the key here is that everybody's moving forward. Now, let me ask you this, Jonathan. What did the goals going into COP26 look like when they came out on the other side?
Well, I think we've actually already dealt with a lot of that the goals were to get on a path to 1.5 degrees centigrade. So in that sense, it was a failure, as I say. We didn't get there. Yeah. But we got part way. So the current pledges amount to reducing emissions about 40% below current levels by 2050.
Okay.
What you really need is to reduce them to zero by 2050. So there are two things. One is to do what people are pledged to do and get it down at least 40%. And the other is how the heck can we get it down to zero? So I think it's worth thinking of those in stages, because the first stage is not actually all that demanding. One thing people worry is, will this mean big sacrifice? Will this mean that we'll have to give up our standard of living? The answer is no. And particularly for that first half, it can be done relatively easily with especially increasing energy efficiency and moving to renewables. And right now, renewables like wind and solar are actually throughout most of the world the cheapest method of installing new power. They are 2/3 or more of new power now being installed throughout the world. And technology is moving forward, so that's getting better and better. So this is a win-win. This way you can get power cheaper than you can get it now from coal or nuclear or natural gas or anything else, and you can reduce emissions. Energy efficiency is what I like to call the big sleeper here. Nobody really understands much about energy efficiency, and you can't see it the way you can see a solar or wind plant. But we have the potential to cut our energy use up to 50% through greater efficiency without any sacrifice. In other words, you insulate a house better, and you're just as warm as you were before, but with significantly less energy use. Major buildings, commercial buildings, similarly, effective insulation can make a huge difference in reducing energy use. And this is what I call raising the floor and lowering the ceiling. That if you can lower the ceiling of total energy use through efficiency, then you've cut your task in half. You only have to get 50% of what you had to get before through renewables, which means that it's more conceivable that we can, in fact, get there, that we can replace 50% of what we have now in energy supply with renewables. If you said we have to replace 100%, then that would be extremely difficult. But 50% is conceivable, and that can be done if you do the energy efficiency half. If you cut back the energy use and simultaneously increase the renewables, then you can squeeze out the fossil fuels in between the two.
I like that strategy, and on the surface, it doesn't seem to be that insurmountable to implement. The new developing countries, the developing nations, who are now demanding a lot more power than they used to. But you're saying that 2/3 of the new power being installed is renewable, and so that's a good thing, right?
It is.
And it's a natural thing because this new power that the developing nations are bringing online and are requiring is going to be good power, renewable, so that's good. But then us who have been the perpetrators of the fossil fuel issues, we're going to need to make strides through, as you said, energy efficiency.
Well, a lot of this, though, is somewhat painless. I just got a plug-in hybrid car, which changes the gas mileage that my family gets from about 25 miles per gallon to something between 70 and 100 miles per gallon. So that's why I say doing the first half is easy. Mm-hmm. In effect, we've already done that. And electrification of vehicles is gaining tremendous steam. Mm-hmm. There's enormous interest among investors in investing in electrical vehicles, and the infrastructure for electrical vehicles is significantly improving. So this means you now have big trucks that are electric. So this is somewhat painless. Rather than drive a gas car or gas truck, you drive an electric car or truck, and it comes cheaper. And you get much better mileage. So it's not a sacrifice. There's a lot of stuff that we can do like that, which will move us significantly towards the goal, and doesn't mean that we're going to freeze in the dark and not have heating for our houses and have to turn all the lights off. Conservation is important, but conservation doesn't have to mean sacrifice.
Indeed. And it makes me wonder, as you're talking, why does not every building code for every locality require that new construction of anything, residential or commercial buildings, that new construction and substantial rehabilitation of their buildings also has efficiency built into all of those aspects of it.
There are also things like shifting away from natural gas. Rather than automatically installing natural gas, which commits us to 50 years more of natural gas supply, shifting to electrification. But then the other part of that is, if we do that, if we shift to electrical vehicles, electricity in buildings, we need a much better national grid. Mm-hmm. This is one of the things which has been in the infrastructure proposals from the current administration, is a lot of upgrading of the national electric grid, because that grid is barely making it now, and we're going to need it to have to handle a lot more electric power, and also to balance that, to be able to balance the periods when wind and solar are producing a lot and when they're not producing so much, which means it needs storage systems. So improving the electrical grid is a critical component of this.
But isn't that done state by state?
It's mostly done state by state, but there's an important national component. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has powers. It's extremely important to get either federal action or interstate cooperation because, of course, a lot of energy goes interstate. It's a grid. It's a regional grid and a national system of connected regional grids, so that it can't be each state going it alone.
Well, and again, that seems very doable.
Yeah, we actually made some progress on it, which has been written into law with the Infrastructure Act that passed last November.
Okay, and Jonathan, I'm so sorry. We're going to need to almost stop abruptly to go to break. We're over time. But we'll be right back on the other side. We are with Dr. Jonathan Harris, visiting scholar at Tufts University and senior research fellow at Boston University. And he's telling us about the road from COP26, what did we accomplish. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on the road from COP26. What did we get done? And we are back with Dr. Jonathan Harris, who is making us a lot smarter about these very important issues that affect our health and our well-being and our day-to-day living. And so we really appreciate him helping us to break down all of this important information. Now, Jonathan, and again, you were talking about how some of the things came out on the other side, but what would you say is perhaps the most important and impactful things to come out of COP26?
Well, we have these strengthened pledges, both in terms of what nations are going to do and in terms of raising money for mitigation to help developing countries with mitigation and with adaptation to climate change. So that's all significant progress. But as we said, even if everything that countries pledged happens, it falls well short of the goal. One of the important things that came out of this COP, which had not come out of previous conferences, was a renewed emphasis on the importance of natural systems and natural climate solutions. Now, what this means is forests, wetlands, soils, and their ability to absorb carbon. I've been talking about reducing emissions of carbon, which is extremely important, and other greenhouse gases. But what forests, wetlands, and soils do is they actually absorb and store carbon, so they take it out of the atmosphere, which is what we really need. And right now, they remove about 1/3 of what humans emit. What we need to do, and what is technically possible to do, is to double or triple that. And then, of course, they would be removing almost all of what humans emit, so that if we can both reduce our emissions and increase absorption, then we would be on the road to net zero. So what does this mean that we should do in terms of...
It sounds amazing on the surface of it. I know you're going to tell us more about it. It's exciting to me because it is something that's within our control. Because, one of the big purposes of Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio is to help people understand these environmental issues that affect our day-to-day lives so that they can be in control. By understanding them and realizing the impacts and the urgencies, then we can do those things that we need to do to help drive solutions. And that's why this whole issue of natural solutions seems exciting to me. Go ahead.
Well, the good thing is that the potential, as I say, is extremely large. I mean, scientists looking at the potential of forests and potential of soils say, that it could easily be doubled, potentially 3 times as much, which would go a long way towards solving the problem. The bad news is we're doing almost everything wrong. We're cutting down existing forests rather than allowing forests to grow and expanding forested area. We are cutting down forests, particularly primary forests, tropical forests and others, which are the best stores of carbon. So, a critical thing is just stop doing harmful things, stop destroying forests. And at COP26, over 100 countries pledged that they would do exactly that. Actually doing it is going to be much more difficult. For instance, Brazil, which is one of the major offenders here, joined in this pledge to stop and reverse forest degradation. Does that mean it's actually going to happen in Brazil? Not soon. But the fact that it's on the table means that it's clearly established as a goal for countries to work towards. In terms of soils, what you need is what are called healthy soils practices, which are systems like organic agriculture, but not necessarily all organic. Simple things like cover crops, crop rotation, use of green manures and animal manures to bring carbon back into the soil. And these are agricultural techniques which are a win-win because they both make the soil more productive, they make the crops more nutritious, and they store carbon. So the lead on this has been taken by a French organization, or originally French, that started in France, called 4 per 1,000. And what that means is that if you could increase the carbon content of soils by only 0.4% per year, that you would go a long way towards filling this gap that we need to fill. And that just means adopting better agricultural practices and stopping very bad agricultural practices, which unfortunately we have a lot of, intensive agriculture, intensive tilling, a lot of use of fertilizer and pesticides. We have to move towards healthier kinds of agriculture. Fortunately, 20 states in the U.S. already have healthy soils bills in place, which provide assistance for farmers in making that transition to what we call more regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, we talked about the regenerative agriculture usually in the summer when we do a whole month of shows on agriculture. And so that seems to be a big area, but it's an area that just about every country takes part in.
Yes, there's enormous potential everywhere. My institute is part of something called the Northeast Healthy Soil Network, which is the New England states plus New York. And that's a small area relative to the world, but there's enormous activity bringing together farmers, researchers, government policymakers to try to shift towards more regenerative agriculture. So this is all very encouraging, but we need to do a lot more of it, and we need to do it on a lot larger scale in order to fill this massive gap.
Indeed. So looking at the healthy soils and the forest, it does appear that ordinary people in their everyday lives may be able to more, perhaps quickly, I don't know if that's the correct word, impact the forest by being advocates.
Yes, supporting good legislation at the local and state level, absolutely.
Because the forest and the trees has a lot to do with local city governments, county governments, and then to a larger degree, state governments.
There are also some political issues concerning corporations, particularly, say, production of toilet paper, which is done from old-growth forests, especially in Canada, which is environmentally terrible, but could be replaced with recycled paper to a great degree. So pressure on corporations to stop employing destructive methods is the one important part of this too.
Oh my, yes. It's everything is interwoven, and you want to say complicated, but a lot of it does come back though to just like you said, educating everyday people in their everyday lives of the habits that they have, how they are causing or how they can be tweaked to bring about environmental benefit.
Well, it's very much a matter of national and state policy as well as individual action. I don't like sort of putting blame on individuals, saying, you by your lifestyle are destroying the planet.
Yes.
Because number one, I think it's wrong. It's a matter of national and state policy and corporate policies. And number two, it implies to people that they have to make some huge sacrifice, that they have to give up the way they like to live in order to help the planet. And that is not true. We need to change things. We need to change the way we do things. But it's not a sacrifice. It's not a huge cutback in standard of living. It might mean that you would think more about, let's not be wasteful in our use of heat, our use of gasoline. Let's think seriously about getting a vehicle which will be highly fuel efficient. Let's think seriously about getting the house insulated. But none of that, like I say, is a huge sacrifice. One thing we need from government, by the way, is financing. So that if somebody wants, say, to insulate their house, but they don't have the several $1,000s that it would take to do that, that there would be long-term, low or no interest government loans to do that.
And those code requirements to require insulation with new construction.
On new buildings, yes.
And with substantial rehab, too. Generally, I used to be in the development in the building industry, and most local codes will also, at a certain point of rehab, like if you're rehabbing 50% or more, then the new regs will kick in. And I really loved, Jonathan, that you look at all of these things that you research and you study, and you look at and are able to point us to the fact that it's not requiring a great big sacrifice. In other words, it's doable.
Certainly the first part of it is doable. Ambitious goal of actually getting to net zero is going to be more challenging. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't attempt it. What we should do is start with the easier stuff and then move on to stuff which is going to, in fact, be more difficult or more costly. But we have a big ally there, which is the technological progress.
Indeed.
That we are getting a lot of improved technology in things like battery storage, which will make renewable power much easier. In the renewable agriculture area, one of the things that scientists are working on is measuring the carbon that's stored through soil practices.
Oh, I love that.
If a farmer adopts good practices, how much carbon, in fact, is being stored there?
We're going to go to break, but I want to continue that conversation after the break. If they can measure that, then you can show people, and I think there's more sensitivity to it. We'll be right back on the other side of the break with Dr. Jonathan Harris, who's telling us about our accomplishments and where we go forward from COP26. Thank you. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, central markets, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. And our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years with a holistic approach looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. To today's show on COP26. The road from it. What have we accomplished as a result of that? And we are back with Dr. Jonathan Harris, visiting scholar at Tufts University and a senior research fellow at Boston University. And he really is making us smarter about what happened at COP26 and the hope for the future that it gives us. So welcome back, Jonathan. Again, we're just so glad that you could make time to join us.
Just in case anybody came in late, COP26 was the international conference that took place late last year on climate change and getting nations to pledge to reduce their emissions over time.
Yep, Conference of the Partners. So you were talking about an important lead behind being natural solutions to helping us to meet somewhere near that benchmark of 1.5 degrees. And so looking at COP26, though, and the lead behind Jonathan, what indicators were there or what indicators are there that perhaps there's more commitment this time around or not?
Well, in terms of the natural solutions, the good thing was that they got a lot more airtime. In previous COPs, the focus has been, rightly, on reducing emissions, on having developed nations drastically cut their emissions, and having developing nations like China and India pledge to peak their emissions. It's unrealistic to tell them you can't develop any more and you have to start reducing your fossil fuel use and emissions immediately. But it is realistic to say you have to start reducing the percentage of fossil fuels and look towards the day not too far off when you will actually start reducing the total emissions. So the emphasis has been on those two things, on getting developed nations to cut emissions, getting developing nations to agree to a lower emissions path and to an eventual cut in emissions. But now we have this third component, which did get a fair amount of attention at the recent conference, of natural climate solutions to actually pull carbon out of the air and store it, at which natural systems are actually the best at doing. There was also some attention to artificial systems for pulling carbon out of the air.
Such as, what would the artificial systems be?
So-called carbon capture and storage. They actually have developing now in some places like Iceland artificial trees where they have systems which directly pull carbon out of the atmosphere and store it. Unfortunately, it turns out these systems are very expensive. And it's also not clear what you do with the carbon once you've pulled it out of the atmosphere. The main thing that's done with it now is to inject it into gas and oil wells to help push out gas and oil, which obviously is not what you want to do in the overall picture.
The fracking liquid, that's what that sounds like?
No, it's not fracking liquid. It's an injection of gas into subterranean formations of carbon dioxide gas to help extract more oil or more natural gas.
Either way, it's bad.
Which is not what you want to do. There's a small market for things like carbonized beverages. But in any case, that whole artificial carbon capture and storage really has yet to prove itself as workable in any way economically. On the other hand, trees, plants, wetlands, and also ocean systems have been removing carbon from the atmosphere successfully for millennia and are continuing to do that.
That's what they were made to do.
They could do significantly more. And many human practices right now are limiting or destroying their ability to do that. So there's a huge area in the natural systems where, by changing our practices, we could achieve significantly more carbon storage, which in a sense is the holy grail here, to actually pull the carbon that's in the atmosphere and causing the problem out of the atmosphere and store it permanently in soils. Soils right now store about 2 to 3 times as much carbon as there is in the atmosphere. And the capacity of soils to store carbon is very significantly greater. And during our agricultural history, since the pioneers came into the Great Plains in the Midwest, we have reduced carbon soils, and we've reduced topsoil depths by something like 50%, different amounts, different places. But we have done basically enormous damage to the ability of soils and forests and also oceans, coastal areas, to store carbon.
Now, is there any such thing as a chart that says for every 5 trees or 6 trees or whatever that you plant, it will remove X amount of carbon out?
Yeah, there is. A mature tree can remove like 1 to 2 tons of carbon. But one of the interesting things is that if you plant a tree, that's a good thing. But it's going to take 20 to 30 years before it really reaches maturity and is storing and pulling out a lot of carbon. So much the best thing is to leave existing trees, which are already large and have a lot of surface area to pull out carbon, to leave them in place to grow further. And that will be much more effective, at least for the next 20 to 30 years, than planting new trees. Doesn't mean we shouldn't plant trees. We should be planting trees. But it's even more important not to cut them down.
I got you. So the thing that people used to promise us, and many people still promise us, is for every one knocked down, we're going to plant a new one. Well, that leaves us with a 20 to 30-year gap, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And maybe more than that. 20 to 30 is the minimum if it's a fast-growing tree. But some of the most effective trees at removing and storing carbon, it's more like 50 to 100 years.
I can imagine, but you remember when that was all the rage?
Well, the problem is that sounds like an easy solution, but it isn't a solution.
It really isn't.
It's not bad to plant trees. It's good to plant trees. It's good to reforest. But
it's not replacing
protecting existing ecosystems is really absolutely critical. That's where we're doing a bad job now, and we really need to change practices.
So, Jonathan, were there any other signs or indicators that there's a bigger or more deeper commitment coming out of COP this year over previous conferences?
I think so. That's my impression, that there is a stronger commitment. There's still, as we said, huge gaps. And the next conference, the COP27, becomes very important because that's the first opportunity to strengthen all these commitments. And also, particularly with regard to natural solutions, it's an opportunity to take a step forward there. On forests, we got an actual pledge at COP26. On soils, we don't really have specific pledges yet. So we need to do more on soils and agriculture, and we need to hold people's feet to the fire on the pledge that they have made on existing forests.
Indeed, and with this new annual reporting or justing, I'm looking forward to that in terms of helping to give us, I want to say immediate guidance, but at least more immediate almost information with which to guide us. So that part is really exciting. Jonathan, let me ask you, who are the major players coming out of this COP? And I guess I mean major players, those who are the biggest advocates or who seem to be putting maybe their money where their mouth is. Who are the leaders that are coming out of this last COP, and what are their hot button areas or focus areas?
Well, the biggest three emitters are China, the U.S., and Europe taken together, the European Union. So those are necessarily the major players. One of the encouraging things about the recent conference was a pledge to boost U.S.-China cooperation. Now, as we know from reading the news, U.S. and China are not always cooperating, but there was a pledge to boost cooperation. There was some disappointment that the Chinese top leader did not attend, but in the middle of the conference, there was an announcement that an agreement had been reached. Europe has done a lot to put their money where their mouth is. They still also have a long way to go, but they have been willing to take a lot of leadership on development of renewable energy. And they also, like I say, the French have taken leadership in the agriculture area. So I would say those three, the biggest emitters, are necessarily the biggest players in either getting something going or not getting something going.
Well, at least that's heartening. At least they realize that they have a heightened responsibility because they are such big emitters. And at the same time, they do have the heft and the gravitas to make a big difference when they are committed to doing what they pledged to do.
Then there are a lot of middle-level players like Brazil, South Africa, India, whose role is also pretty critical. One of the specific things out of the conference was a pledge to help South Africa transition away from coal, which they are heavily dependent on.
And I've read a lot about that and hope to be able to talk a little bit more about that later. We are going to have to go now. We have come to the end of our time, but you have really made us smarter about what went on at the COP and how that is going to affect us at the kitchen table, as they say, and in our day-to-day living. So we really appreciate that because you've answered the question, why should we care? We have been with Dr. Jonathan Harris, who is a visiting scholar at Tufts University, as well as a senior research fellow at Boston University, and the author of a number of important works on the whole economy of climate change and energy. So thank you, Jonathan. We really appreciate you making time for us today.
And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is a result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourself. And each of those tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you, and join us again next week as we talk more about healthy living, healthy planet, and how our environment so affects our health and our well-being. Thank you.